Dionysus, god of wine, patron of the theatrical arts, leader of the Bacchaean cult, lord of ecstasy and madness. But was he a revered god in ancient Greece? Or more specifically, was he an Olympian? In this video, we try to learn about how much authority this god had in the old days. So like and subscribe if you are into such content. Dionysus was certainly a respected deity in ancient Greece, like all gods should be. But among them, a group of gods holding the most power and authority were the 12 Olympian gods residing in Mount Olympus. And when you are presented with the names of 12 Olympians, you are most likely conflicted between two possible lists of names, where one features Hestia and another substituting her with Dionysus. But why is this the case? Why would the ancient Greeks simply replace one of their most significant gods with another one? And why, out of all deities, a simple wine god should be there to fill up the empty throne? To know this, we need to know a bit about Dionysus and his ascension to the ranks of an Olympian. You see, Dionysus was introduced much later as an Olympian god, and was, from a certain perspective, much less revered than other Olympian gods. Much because Dionysus was not a full-born god to begin with. Unlike other sons of Zeus like Apollo, Ares, or Hermes, who were full-fledged god having both parents that are divine, Dionysus' father was of course the god Zeus, but was mothered by a mortal princess Semele. This makes Dionysus more of a demigod rather than a full-fledged immortal. But it is still possible for a demigod to later gain godhood, as we see in the case of Heracles or Hercules. With that being said, there is no actual story in the Greek mythos that tells where Hestia retires from her throne and offers it to Dionysus. Rather, he just simply started occurring among the names of Olympians after a certain period of time. And this transition was slow and smooth, so one cannot pick a point from exactly when Hestia was replaced by Dionysus. But this transition had to do with the worship of Dionysus, his connections to wine, and who Dionysus originally was. Firstly, addressing to the wine association of Dionysus, it was more than just a drink that Dionysus was associated with. Yes, Dionysus was the creator of wine in the mythos, but more than that, he was the god of fruitful liquid that flows all through the nature, and his wine was subsequently a reflection of the divine elixir of life, but in a form that mortals can consume. And that is why drunkenness was often associated with being possessed with the powers of Dionysus and gaining of his higher truth. But Dionysus was also a fertility god, a god of life and nature, a god of theatrics and festival. And in his more bizarre form, he was the deity associated with the underworld. But in classical Greece, we don't see this Dionysus, who is a dark underworld god or a wild deity, but rather a more fruitful god of wine, festive, and theaters. So what caused this shift in the characteristics of the god? To know this, we need to understand a bit about Greek civilization and its timeline. Although it is far more complicated to understand historical Greek ages. But in simple terms, the ancient Greece that we most often speak of is called the classical Greece, that was roughly 800 to 300 BCE. Before that, there was a civilization called the Mycenaean Greece, which existed between 1600 and 1200 BC. Their language was dubbed as the Linear B script. And in this civilization, we see gods of classical Greeks, worshipped in a much primitive form. One can say these deities were prototypes for what the later Greeks would be worshipping. Among them, Dionysus was one of the chief gods under the name of Dionysus. So we can see the version of Dionysus predates our more charming, festive-loving wine god of classical Greece and is a wild, raging underworld god. The worship cult of this Dionysus is old, and perhaps it began as a cult of wine itself. And thus we know little to nothing about this Dionysus. We do know, however, that this Dionysus was a much darker and wild wine god and was worshipped as a chthonic deity, that is, a deity related to the underworld. In this period, Dionysus held immense power as being the god of wine that drive mind to drunkenness. He had the power to alter minds, influencing men to go crazy and lose sanity. His mind control powers was said to be so great that it could effectively hypnotize or drive entire armies or even kingdoms to insanity. He also had strong connections to the underworld, as in this version, Dionysus, under the name of Zagreus, was the son of Persephone, with of course his father being Zeus, establishing his strong connections to the underworld. There is also a story of how he died and was reborn, making him the god of death, rebirth, and life as well. His worship was kept a secret, but mainly composed of rituals including heavy drinking, dancing in the wild, with groups fornicating. This practice was carried on to later classical Greece, but was highly discarded by the nobilities. You see, Dionysus was a wild god at this point, and his worship were equally wild and unsophisticated in nature. The philosophy behind this was these followers who were not bothered by the restraints of society, and is rather a part of nature than the man-made society. The kings and monarchs and powerful people who mostly run the society thus banned the worship of Dionysus, as it conflicted their social norms. Thus these practices and groups were ostracized from the society, so much so that Dionysus himself was not mentioned in the most famous epic poem, the Iliad. As a result, others that were also ostracized by powerful men of the state, mainly women and slaves, who were much restrained by social norms and didn't have much rights in society to begin with, turned to the practice of Dionysian worship. This is because it is said that in the eyes of Dionysus, men, women, slaves, plants, animals, and all others were same, and all had a place in the Dionysian culture. And this is what the normal people of society hated. These two opposing ideas conflicted, and Dionysian worship was nothing but a small part of ancient Greek culture, and was held in rocky mountains or forests, rather than civilized or organized temple. But this was a primitive time, and change was about to happen. The main issue with Dionysian culture was there was no norms or hierarchy, and society is made of hierarchy, and so the nobilities incorporated their own forms of Dionysian worship. The common ground here is wine. From the most savage followers of Dionysus to the most sophisticated kings of the state, all enjoy wine. And so, most societies started worshipping Dionysus as simply a wine god, and avoided his underworld connections. As the archaic and classical Greek ages came to be, people tend to avoid talking about chthonic deities, and so the underworld aspect of Dionysus, as well as his death or rebirth, was not much focused on. Much later in classical Greek times, roughly around 500 BC, when plays, dramas, and theaters were expanding into fame, Dionysus, who was already a god of wine, was connected with festival as well as theaters. Pisistratus, an Athenian politician at the time, was the main reason that Dionysian worship was introduced to Athens, and with many playwrights like Sophocles, Aristophanes, or Euripides, and many more, Society in general began to adopt Dionysus in socially constructed elements like theater, drama, and festivity. And just like that, Dionysus became one of the most popular gods of ancient Greece, even being an Olympian, the highest class of the gods. This was the transition, the shift of dynamic of a terrifying chthonic deity to a social, charming, and festivity god. But why does he have to replace Hestia of all gods? For this, we need to understand gods in ancient Greece play a huge political and social role. Zeus, for obvious reasons of being the supreme god, cannot be replaced, neither Hera, being the queen of gods. Every god has a significant role to at least one group of society, like Apollo for musicians, Artemis for hunters, Ares and Athena for every war-waging society, Poseidon for sailors and traders, and even Hephaestus was worshipped by blacksmiths, carpenters, and more. So one can say Hestia was the only one with the least authority over the society at the time. Sure, her worship was never stopped, but was vital to the state and home. But Dionysus now seemed much more authoritarian and influential than Hestia, and thus by 300 BC, writers, poets, scholars, politicians, and eventually all began to accept Dionysus as one of the 12 Olympians. This was strongly established over 500 to 300 BC. Theatrical events were held every year since 5th century BC in Athens in the honor of the god Dionysus, and temples were built in multiple places. And that's how a wild and rogue Mycenaean Dionysus became the fruitfully theatrical-loving god of wine of classical Greek era. There is far too much to talk about Dionysus in a single video, so stay tuned if you want to know more about the mysteries of this god.